Okay, looks like they opened up the doors to our conference hall. Fantastic. We'll let people funnel in and we'll get started real quick. Wait for our magic number of participants here before we do that. And we just hit it. Wow. Wow, this is a lot of people. Awesome. Let's get started. So hello, everyone, and I hope you're joining us safe, healthy, and happy from the comfort and security of your own home. Since so many of us are working from home, I'd like to invite you to go ahead and tweet a picture of your work from home setup. I've already checked out a couple today, and I've seen some very tidy people and some very messy people. You know who you are. If you have questions or a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, please use that to submit your questions. And the slides, we'll find out if they can be shared, but you can always go back for a replay of this session, and you'll have about 30 days to do that. Stick around for a raffle at the end of our event, and thanks to all of our sponsors for making this possible. Now, I can say that I've been looking forward to this session just about all day. I've been working with WVD for quite a while, and most recently I've been doing a lot of performance studies regarding Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session. Of course, these guys have been crucial through all of it. With all the work from home initiatives lately, I can tell you that I hear WVD a lot from the folks that we're talking to. So for this very interesting session, I'd like to introduce both Pieter Wigleven and Stefan Georgiev, calling in from their homes in Seattle, Washington. So take it away, guys.
Hello, everyone. We'll be talking about Windows Virtual Desktop and mostly about what's coming soon. So Blair already did a great introduction. So very briefly, my name is Pieter Wigleven, and I'm a program manager on the Windows Virtual Desktop team. And then virtually sitting next to me, we have Stefan. And Stefan will be talking about MSIX app attach for about 30 minutes. But I'll be spending the first 10 first to talk about a few of the new features that are coming soon to Windows Virtual Desktop. So let's talk about those. Let's talk about the upcoming features that we're rolling out. Now, a couple of the key features that we'll be rolling out soon, and I have timelines in a couple of slides, is the fact that Windows Virtual Desktop is launching with a new portal that's integrated in what we call ARM, the Azure Resource Manager. When we shipped WVD, initially we had PowerShell support and REST APIs and all kinds of tools to automate the deployment and management of WVD. And it's great for specific scenarios. But some customers, they just want to have a UI where they can click around, integrate it into their existing role-based access control, for example. So we got solid feedback from everyone saying, automation is great, but give us a GUI. So that's the thing that's coming out next. Another thing we kept on hearing is we want to make sure that for some customers, we keep all the data in a specific region, the region of their choice. And although WVD allows you to store virtual machines in your subscription and you decide where you're going to deploy those VMs, the metadata from the service itself used to be US only. So now we're giving you the option to also select a region where you want to store that data. Now, the other thing, as part of the new Azure portal experience, the deployment becomes a lot more easier. And we've got solid feedback from partners and customers saying WVD is great, but deploying it is a lot of manual steps. I have to go into PowerShell and create a tenant and go to this consent page and then select all kinds of drop-down list box and do it a couple of times. And it works in the end, but it's not super friendly to get your first deployment out there. So we've simplified it a lot. And this means that the amount of steps that are required is just reduced dramatically. Now let's talk more about what the ARM-based feature actually, what kind of benefits it brings you. So the other key piece of feedback that we're getting is when we want to publish either a desktop or an application, we have to assign individual users, which is great if it's just an organization or a POC with maybe 5 users. But we all know that as soon as you start ramping up, it's dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of users that need access to desktop or applications. So now what we can do, instead of assigning those per individual, since we leverage Azure Resource Manager, you can just target a specific Azure AD group, where you can say, well, this group needs a specific app or desktop, and off you go. Like mentioned on the previous slide, you can use your existing RBAC or role-based access control to define who gets access to what in terms of the management. And we also no longer need a separate PowerShell module. So we still have all the automation that we mentioned earlier, but now we have integration with AZ PowerShell. So you can just use all of your PowerShell functionality without having to download separate stuff. Same goes with the UI. Like mentioned before, we now have, or we will be getting, an Azure Portal UI. And then on the next slide, I'll show you what it looks like. I'll do a quick demo. I think the rest we kind of discussed about already, so there's no longer the need for consenting. You can select the location for your metadata, and we can integrate with all of the Azure services, including log analytics, which just makes logging and monitoring a lot more easier. So let's just dive in a very quick demo on what the portal will look like. So for this, I'm going to switch to my browser. And here you can see the Azure portal. And what I've done is I already looked up the Windows Virtual Desktop over here. So if I search for Windows Virtual Desktop, this will bring you over here. And basically, it will bring you to this page, which will give you some information about how to create your first host pool. Now here on the left, you can see we have 3 sections. We have host pools, application groups, and workspaces. So host pools, I'm sure you're familiar with that term, but it's just a collection of hosts in a pool, hence the word host pool, which all have a same purpose. So it could be that you have a host pool for contractors, or maybe for finance department, or a specific use case. With application groups, you can add either applications or desktops in group and publish those into a workspace. So the workspace is basically what the end user will be seeing in the end. Now, I'm not going to walk through all of the options because I'm sure you can guess what the options are. Like you can spin up virtual machines, you can assign desktops or applications. The only thing I quickly want to show is how easy it is to spin up a WVD environment. Now, the one thing which I'm just skipping is the fact that there are some prerequisites. Like we're going to spin up virtual machines that have to be domain joined. Now, the question is, where are you going to domain join those to? So either you have line of sight to a Active Directory by maybe using ExpressRoute or VPN, or you spun up your own VM hosting an Active Directory, or you're using something which is called Azure ADDS, which is a domain controller as a service. So I'm skipping over a couple of those steps, but let's assume you've done those. You can just go here, hit create a host pool, and this will ask you a few basic questions. Now, first of all, which resource group? So resource group is just, let's say, a container for resources. You specify a host pool name, let's say demo host pool. You select a location where the VMs will be deployed into, and you can also specify whether it's a personal or whether it's a pooled scenario. And then you got more options like selecting whether you want to optimize for costs or for performance. I'm sure this group like to optimize for performance, I'm sure. And then next, we just have to go through a couple of questions like, do you already have virtual machines or do you want to deploy a couple of them? So this is where you can decide what kind of VMs, which region you're going to deploy them to, the amount. You can select what kind of an image you would like to deploy. So we support Windows Server 2012 R2 and up. We even support Windows 7, Windows 10 Enterprise, and then Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. We're going to talk about that specific SKU in a bit more detail in a few slides, because we see that the vast majority of our customers are using Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. As a matter of fact, over 95% of all the VMs that are being running or being spun up as part of WVD are running Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. Now, I'll just hit no that I already have some virtual machines just to go through this wizard. We basically add some tags if you want, and you can hit create. And after 10, 15 minutes, your VMs will be deployed. There's an agent installed that will create an outbound connection into our management plane, and you got yourself your first WVD environment deployed. So just compare this with the traditional on-premise deployments where you have to purchase hardware, get licenses, install everything, domain join, add all the roles, and then manage and patch and all of the logistics that come into play, that could set you back days, weeks, or months if it's a big customer. And here you can just deploy in a couple of clicks, so it's fairly easy. So the Azure portal is one of the things that is probably our #1 requested feature, and it's coming soon. As a matter of fact, very soon. Right now, we're about to wrap up our private preview and entering our public preview, which means that anyone who's joining this, this live stream can sign up for it as well. And at the end of H1 of this calendar year, we expect to have GA with more additional geos in the second half of this calendar year. So stay tuned, we'll open up for public preview soon. And like mentioned before, anyone can use it. The next thing I want to talk about is Azure automation. So this won't come as a surprise, but the graph you see on the right is probably what you and your customers are experiencing as well. If you got the typical productivity worker, in the weekend, they rarely work. And then on Monday to Friday, there's a big peak where the vast majority is logging on or authenticating to their machines around 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 a.m. and then spinning off at the end of the workday. Nothing special here. You can see that this graph is coming from our WVD environment. We took this screenshot from March 19th in our Amsterdam cluster. We did see additional demand for WVD afterwards. As a matter of fact, in some regions, we've seen our connections increased by tenfold. So the amount of interest for WVD is overwhelming. Now, how do you make sure that you scale down those VMs if you don't need them? We used to have scripts available that will allow you to just, based on specific triggers, like for example, CPU usage for a given time, would just either spin up or spin down virtual machines. Now, the scripts that we supplied were great, they worked, but you had to install them or configure them as a scheduled task in a separate virtual machine that had to run 24/7. And it worked, but it was not the most elegant solution. So what we worked on is integrating it into Azure automation. And this allows you to configure it as a runbook, which is a service or part of a service in Azure. And that will just give you a lot less costs because you don't require that additional VM that's running 24/7. And it's highly available because Microsoft will take care of the automation behind the scenes. So we'll make sure this thing always runs. So it's just a more elegant solution, which is available very, very soon. So another feature that we're shipping is service tags. A question we get very often is which URLs or host names or IP addresses do we need to whitelist or add as an outbound rule to our host pool or to our network security group to make sure that Windows Virtual Desktop is functioning as designed. Now you can see we documented, this is just a screenshot from our public documentation page. You can see we have a couple of URLs, but entering these could take you a little bit of time, especially if you have to do it multiple times, and maybe they'll change. So instead of having to enter all of these host names and destinations, you can now use a service tag. So let me just quickly show you what that looks like. So if I go back to the Azure portal and I pick a security group, a network security group. So now I can define what kind of inbound or outbound security rules I can define. So let me just add a new outbound security rule. Now, if I browse to the right, this is where I can define all of the ports and URLs and protocols, etc. And now we have a new option. Well, service tag is not the new option, but the thing which is new is that now we can just search for Windows Virtual Desktop. And that's it. So if you allow Windows Virtual Desktop, we can make sure that whatever URLs or host names, etc., are needed, just bubble up into this one service tag. So it's a lot easier to whitelist URLs. So one of the last things I'd like to discuss before I move or I hand over to Stefan is the image or images we have available in the Azure Gallery. What we've seen is that the vast majority of customers is starting with a blank or a vanilla image from the Azure Gallery. We also support customizing it. You can even download it, use Hyper-V to customize it, upload it back into Azure if you want to include your LOB apps. But a lot of customers, they just spin up a vanilla image and then deploy on top of that. And like mentioned before, the most popular SKU we have is Windows and Enterprise Multi-Session. We have a version available with and without Office, and for every Windows version, every Windows 10 version, which is supported. So right now that's 1809, 1903, and 1909, and soon we'll have the new 2004 release. If you pick this image, we've tuned a couple of things specifically to Office. For example, we have shared computer activation enabled by default. So in an RDS or a WVD environment, you no longer have any issues with Office licensing if all goes well. We've made changes to OneDrive. So we have a machine-wide installer. So instead of having dozens of binaries that need to be updated, which all live in the user's profile, we now have a machine-wide installer. What's coming soon is a Teams optimized or a WVD Teams optimized client. And this will allow you to offload the audio and video to your local client. So that will just make sure that Teams will work in a virtualized environment just like it would in a normal environment. Well, normal, depending on your definition of normal, but let's say in an environment where you use physical devices. The other change we're making is adding FSLogix into the image. So this is happening in about a month from now. So whenever you download or spin up one of the images listed on the screenshot, FSLogix will be installed by default. It's not configured yet. You don't have to use it, but if you want to use it, it's just adding a couple of settings and it will be active. Another ongoing effort, we have multiple folks in our team who are focusing at performance. I'm sure you've seen it, is the user density when going from Windows Server to Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session, it decreased. And it's also because you get more in return. I mean, Windows 10 Enterprise is just a much richer operating system. So it has more functionality, it has more features, it's more consistent with the experience people have on their normal PCs. But in return, we took a little bit of a performance impact or performance penalty. So we're trying to catch up. And one of the things we're focusing at right now is AppX registrations or AppX performance. Whenever you spin up WVD with Windows, when you log in, AppX will have to register some what we call essential or critical applications. And this will just delay the overall user profile creation. We cannot go to the desktop until these registrations are done. So we're trying to make sure that we move as much of those critical or essentials AppX registrations whenever the user is already productive. That's one of the efforts we're doing, and we're trying to come up with a redesigned AppX framework that will just optimize experience overall. Another thing which we get asked pretty often, and I think this group will be interested quite a bit, is what about all these tools that are available, like the VMware optimizer or the Citrix optimizer? Why don't you guys run that as part of the image? And the performance has to be much better. So we've done a lot of in-house testing, and what you can see at the bottom is this graph or this table that just appeared, which shows you the CPU comparison between Windows and Enterprise Multi-Session without any changes and the one with changes. It's actually the other way around. So on the left side, you can see a tuned image where we use the VMware optimizer just with everything enabled, very aggressive tuning, which we probably couldn't ship anyway that way, but that's what we did. And on the right side, you can see it by default if we didn't do anything. The regression we saw was about 1.2%. So you could turn this around by saying we gained 1.2% of CPU performance, which is not significant. So this is one of the reasons why we're looking into other areas to add more performance, because we feel that this is not the most efficient way. We might look at it later, but that's one of the main reasons why we decided to choose this path. So the last slide before I hand over to Stefan. Another thing which is coming up is the Linux Thin Client SDK. Our goal is to make sure that the performance of the Linux Client SDK is on par with other non-Windows clients. And this SDK allows you to create your own Linux solution. And if you're interested, you can find a link on this slide in the aka.ms WVD Linux survey. please leave behind your details and we'll come back to you with more information on how you can get access to the Linux SDK. So with that, I'm going to hand over to the real expert, which is Stefan, and Stefan's going to talk about MSIX app attach.
So, thank you, Peter. Can you just stop sharing so I can share my screen? Thank you. And I'm hoping everybody can see my screen. And awesome. I'm gonna.
Not yet, Stefan.
Not yet? Okay.
There
Should
we
be coming.
go.
Yay.
Yep. Perfect.
Great victory. Awesome. Thank you, Peter. So what I'm going to talk about today is MSIX app attach. And we're going to take a deep dive and discuss some of the implementation decisions and what the technology is offering and how we are looking to take advantage of the MSIX packaging format inside of Windows Virtual Desktop for the near future, and then mid and long-term future, we are looking into introducing MSIX app attach outside of WVD. Before we can have a meaningful conversation, I would like to level set us on the terminology. Being a brand new technology, there are some misconceptions and challenges, and generally audiences tend to impart existing terminology into this new technology. So with that in mind, the first thing I want to talk about is the concept of expanding an MSIX. For those of you that are familiar with MSIX, that is a packaging format that was announced by Microsoft about close to 2 years now ago at Ignite. And what it does, it is a replacement in quotes for MSI, Apex, click to run, exe, setup files, batch files, scripts that install your application. But it comes with some additional functionality, which can take their own session to explain. When we say expanding an MSIX, that means we are taking an existing MSIX package and we are putting it as a loose file, meaning that we just expand the package and we're putting it in a VHD. So we're not doing any kind of packaging or modification. We're really like copy pasting the content of the MSIX into a VHD file. And later on, I'll chat on why VHD and some of the other options that we have there. Staging. Staging is a process and term that we have borrowed from the MSIX terminology. And it means exactly the same thing. Staging tells the operating system that a certain set of files representing an application or multiple applications is available at our location. The one difference here with MSIX app attach compared to the traditional MSIX, that when we say staging, we're actually not doing any movement of bits from the network location to the virtual machine. So everything stays on the file share where the package has been expanded. Now, once we have staged the application on a virtual machine or a physical machine, the next process, the next step of the life cycle of MSIX app attach is to tell the operating system that that user or a set of users have permissions to this application. And that is the registration process. The registration process goes and parses those files that we have staged from the network location and makes them visible to the user. That means that you can be on the same machine to different users, and you can register an application for one of them, and the other one, you don't register the application, and the outcome will be that on the same machine, one user sees the application, the other one doesn't. So registration is what assigns the application to the user. Delay registration is similar to registration. It does the same thing with the slight difference that when the initial session gets established to that VM, in order to reduce the performance impact, what we are doing is we are fetching the shortcuts that have been specified for that application, the file associations, and potentially any modifications that are tied to desktop shortcut, start menu, taskbar, something else, that ties to the locations from where the user can start the application. And then we wait from an action for the user to actively start the application for us to go and do the somewhat heavier registration process. So we are delaying the registration by bringing the minimal set of configuration needed for the application to show to the user. And we are delaying the registration, the full registration during the start up time of the application. And we'll see what those times are, and they're about a second, but that's not a huge impact on the start time of the application. On demand, that is a self-serve functionality that we're planning to introduce, which will allow users to themselves select from a list of pre-approved applications those that they need in their session right away. Using the on-demand or self-serve, we have zero impact on session establishment, but allow the user the functionality to bring only the applications that they're gonna use in the current session, or maybe none if there are no such applications. Now that we have the terminology out of the way, what I want to do here is play you a video of doing MSIX app attach. So I've connected to a virtual machine that's part of Windows Virtual Desktop here, and I would want to call out the C drive is 7 gigabytes free space. That's not going to change because we are not copying or bringing any files, any large files to the operating system. Everything stays on the network share. We are registering from the network share. That's one of the key functionality here. So that means that our C drives get to keep their size and potentially get smaller as we offload more and more applications to MSIX app attach. The first thing I would like to show here is that when I go into the start menu, we'll see that there's actually no Visual Studio Code. As you can see, when I type Visual, nothing shows up. Then I'm going to go into PowerShell, and right now, since this is in preview, we're doing all of the work with scripts. But what I want to show you here, that we completed the staging and registration in about 1.5 seconds. I'll chat about what CMFS is. The MSIX staging, you're familiar with that, and the app attach is the registration piece. So you can see that each individual operation took about 500 milliseconds. So in total, 1.5 seconds. If we, sorry. So now when we go back into the start menu, you will see now that Visual Studio Code is now available. So we went from not having Visual Studio Code to having Visual Studio Code app attached on the machine in about 1.5 seconds. And you can see once it started, the end user experience does not change, meaning the interaction, just to the user, it feels native. So if it wasn't for the PowerShell that I'm running on the screen and I was the user, I wouldn't be able to tell. And what I'm doing here, I started an empty new file. And with that file, I'm just gonna enter some random text, and I'm not gonna save the file. I'm just gonna close the application. And then the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna remove the application, which is the opposite of staging. We call it destaging. And you can see that destaging is actually much quicker than staging. We'll chat about how this happens. So we went mounting and deregistration. It took about 500 milliseconds in total. Now, if you go back into the start menu, you can see here that Visual Studio Code is gone again. That is exactly the promise of MSIX app attach, dynamic delivery of application. The application is gone. All into the C drive, you can see space hasn't changed. As mentioned, we bring very minimal amount of files. So we actually restarted. Okay, my bad. So we were over here at the second staging. So now that we staged the second time, Visual Studio Code is back in the start menu. And here you can see that actually was able to pick up where I left off. And the way it's doing that is when we do the deregistration, and why it's important to do the registration versus just abandoning the machine. What this allows us to do is take the user-specific, application-specific set of data, customization, temporary files, and push them into the user profile. Since I'm on the same machine, that happens to the local user profile. If you were using a roaming profile solution like FSLogic, that will move with the user across the machines. So by utilizing MSIX app attach with FSLogic, we are able to segregate the user state from the application state, from the operating system state, and deliver those dynamically as the users migrate between different multi-session environments. And you can see that now we saw how this works on the surface, the end user experience. And what I would like to explain now is how it actually looks from a conceptual point. So we have our user on the left-hand side. She's going to connect through a brokering solution, in this case, Windows Virtual Desktop, to a set of session host VMs that we have running in Azure. And we do have a file share where, as part of the setup of this environment, we have provisioned a set of MSIX app attach applications, and we have configured the profile for that user to be stored. So when the user connects, the first thing, obviously, she goes through the experience, authenticates, get the feed. At that point, the service figures out, oh, you need to land up on one of these 3 machines. As the user lands up on that machine and the session is being established, what is happening is that the FSLogic agent reaches to the network share and brings the user profile. At that moment, as soon as the user profile has been brought, what we do is we go and bring the applications that the user has assigned to them. And this is here comes the question, how do we know what applications have been assigned to this user? And this is some data that we actually read from the service itself. So as part of the configuration, as part of the portal that Pieter showed, we will have a blade there that will allow us to configure MSIX app attach, and there we'll be able to specify a group of users getting a set of applications that we have published for them. So this is the conceptual flow that we saw in the demo. And now let's chat how admins get to think about their environment when they talk about traditional deployment of application versus MSIX app attach. So the left-hand side, we have a traditional deployment of virtual machines, and organizations are usually forced due to security concerns, licensing boundaries around applications, to provision a set of VMs or a set of host pools per user workload. In my example, we have the sales user gets their set of VMs, the HR user gets their set of VMs, and engineering user gets their set of VMs. An enterprise, from their perspective, are almost forced into the situation where they need to create 3 different images, each one for the particular workload, then understand what common applications they need to provide in all of the images, and then introduce customization for each of the image as pertaining to the applications. Then, of course, you got to figure out what do you do with the user profile if that user ends up roaming between VMs. If you go into the right-hand side, which is MSIX app attach, able to dynamically roam the user profile. That is not a new technology, it's been there for a while. What we are able to deliver with MSIX app attach using that registration mechanism is the fact that all our applications, they don't have to be part of the master image anymore. They live on the network share, as we show in the conceptual diagram. And from the network share, based on the membership of that particular user to a group, an Azure AD group, we are able to dynamically register those applications for the user. We have one master image for all the VMs, and we stage the applications for all the VMs. But staging doesn't mean the users get to see the application. It only means that the applications are available for the VM to register if instructed so by the service. And that gives us the flexibility of where we first reducing the size of our golden image, we decouple the lifecycle of update of the operating system from the lifecycle of the applications. It's easier to push just one application. And a lot of these values is what is the promise of application layering However, we're taking it and bringing a new packaging technology that helps us to solve a lot of the challenges that we have around application layer. So being a login VSI event, the next thing I would wanted to talk about is some of the performance that we have tied to MSIX app attach. And with that said, I wanted to, like we saw the demo, there was some data on the screen, how long it takes to stage and register. So these are the two most important operations when it comes to the end user experience. Because one is the user clicks log off, we do some cleanup, like deregister and destage. Those are millisecond operations, but they don't impact the end user experience because the user is already walking out through the door. What impacts the user experience is how long it takes for the application to stage, when the staging happens, how long it takes to register, and when the registration happens. And that's why we have delayed registration. So staging happens when the VM boots. We provision our WVD or other virtualized environment. We configure MSIX app attach. The machines boot on, and hopefully using some of that scaling that Pieter was talking about, the VMs boot on. And as soon as the VM boots, what's going to happen is that VM will go back to the service and ask the service, I am a member of which host pools, and I need to stage which applications. So the staging usually takes about a second per application. So even if you have 20 applications, it's 20 seconds, 50 applications, 50 seconds. But that has no impact on the end user experience because the VM boots as part of the boot, we're doing the staging. And actually the way we're doing the staging, it goes in parallel with other operations that are happening on the machine. So it's not parallel, sorry, it's not serial, it's parallel processing. The registration is what happens per user. And that is why we have the delay registration concept that we are currently gathering the data on. But on average, we take about 800 milliseconds to a second to register an application. So if our user has 20 applications and we need to register all of those as the session logs in, we will need 20 seconds at a time, which is not a smart way to do it because we just added 20 seconds to the login time. With the delay registration, we are able to register about 20 applications in a second. And then the heavy lifting comes part of starting the application. I'm comparing that to the native MSIX. And when I say native MSIX, that is the, if you take an MSIX package today from a vendor, from Microsoft, and you go and install it on your machine, what's going to happen, we'll start the in-operating system installer, and then it's going to take, based on the size of the application, like the bigger the application is, the longer it's going to take for the installer to complete. With MS system, all the files are over here. And the registration for MSIX, it's about the same, the native MSIX, as the process is exactly the same as for MSIX app attach. Now, let's chat about CMFS. So CMFS is a new file system that we have introduced a while back, well, about 2-3 months ago. It started showing up in the insider previews for Windows 10 Enterprise. So what CMFS offers is much faster mount, unmount times and much less overhead on the virtual machine. And the way we achieve that is, it's a nice nifty trick. CMFS is read-only by default and doesn't support read-write functionality. And you'll be like, how does that make sense? Like, why would you need a read-only operating system? It makes a lot of sense for functionality like MSIX app attach, where we're streaming data from a network location, and that data is shared between multiple virtual machines. Further, having multiple users read and write to the same location will cause certain race conditions. Further, it exposes the application for potential abuse by we solve the problem with people breaking the application or modifying it. Further, since we don't have to evaluate any permissions on the files that read only, we get to mount much faster, about 100 milliseconds. And you'll be like, well, 100 milliseconds is not that much faster. Well, it is when you're talking about 50, 100 applications per VM, because those VMs are now flexible. They can serve your entire work fleet of users. What if you have 1,000 applications, which actually for large enterprises is a quite common scenario based on my conversation with enterprises. So even 100 milliseconds times 1,000, it's a significant impact on the mount time. The unmount time is much faster, about 500 times, about 50 times faster. Why? Well, it is much faster because we don't have to do any evaluation on the files. Nobody has modified the files. Nobody has an exclusive walk. We don't have to wait for anything. There's nothing to flush back. So we just go and drop all the references from the operating system. When we talk about the memory consumption, and in this case, I did 50 500 megabyte files. If we mount 50 500 megabytes on a virtual machine, the memory consumption before and after mounting went up 6%, which is not tremendously bad. But again, 50 files, 50 VHDs, 50 applications is not that scary. CMFS, about 2%. That means that it goes, like we'll be able to maintain about the same user density, despite the fact that we're introducing a feature that takes additional memory. And the last piece, since we don't have to do any processing on the VHD, on the CMFS, being a read-only file system, we don't take CPU power to perform the evaluation of the permissions. It just happens. With that said, I would like to discuss the milestones around MSIX App Attach. I don't call it a timeline, as we are quality-based and we need to meet our KPIs. So those of you interested, the MSIX tooling is in preview. That means the APIs, the tools that you need to perform MSIX App Attach are publicly available. You can go play with them and see how they're gonna work in your environment with your applications. Currently, our team is working on integrating Windows Virtual Desktop with CMFS, with the ARM portal that Pieter demoed, and updating the WVD agent to be able to support MSIX App Attach. And this work is ongoing. And as soon as it's completed, we'll open a private preview, and I'll be shared on our channels how you can subscribe or at least volunteer for the private preview. And based on when we meet the criteria for the private preview, we will go and have a public preview of MSIX App Attach integrated into Windows Virtual Desktop Management Portal. With that said, I'll give it back to Pieter to wrap up.
Thanks, Stefan. There was one question which I couldn't answer, and maybe you know. Do you know if there's any guidance for the network latency of speed for storage that MSIX are presented over the network?
We don't have that yet measured. It's something that we are working on, gathering some data.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Well, is that all for now, Pieter? We're a little over time, but I think this has been an extremely informative session.
There was one more thing I wanted to share, which was the resource links for everybody interested in some of the information that was exposed here. We have more information that goes in depth at the links you have on the screen, and you hopefully can see my screen.
Yep, we can see your screen, and of course, this this replay will be available very shortly, within the day, and it'll be available for about 30 days. So there's so much good stuff in here. I'm sure many of us will be going back, including myself, to review a lot of this great information. Do want to extend a special thanks to you, Stefan, and you as well, Pieter. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. I'm personally very excited to see how these technologies are going to behave when we start doing some performance testing with Login Enterprise. So we'll let people gather into their next event, the next session, which is Fast App Delivery Crisis with our folks from Liquidware. So guys at Microsoft, thanks so much. We'll catch you later.
Thank you for having us. Have a good day.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.